Before you get comfortable, as always, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you enjoy our content. Also, let us know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Sometimes our stories keep you up, other times they put you to sleep. Now let's begin. The wind is screaming outside. It tears across the empty fields, rattles the wooden door, and slips like an icy finger through every crack in the wall. Inside a one-room hut made of mud, sticks, and thatch, a family huddles together in the darkness. The fire in the hearth has burned down to faint orange coals, casting long shadows on the dirt floor. There are no blankets thick enough to fight off the cold, no windows to shut out the night, no heat but the warmth of bodies pressed close beneath a shared, scratchy woolen cloak. This is not a scene from a fantasy tale. This is just an ordinary winter night for a medieval peasant. We often romanticize the past. Castles, knights, noble feasts, and gallant heroes fill our imagination. But we rarely think about the everyday people, the ones who worked the land, who lived in drafty huts, and who stared down winter, not with luxury, but with determination. For these peasants, survival was not about slaying dragons or winning battles. It was about getting through the night without freezing. There was no modern insulation, no radiators, no glass panes to keep out the frost. The cold seeped into everything. It bit at their fingers while they tried to sew by firelight. It crept under their clothes while they fed the animals. It even froze their water jugs solid overnight. And yet, generation after generation, they found ways to endure. They knew the cold was coming. It came every year without mercy, and so they prepared, not with machines or gadgets, but with memory, cleverness, and grit. They layered what clothes they had. They packed mud and straw into their walls. They burned peat and dung when firewood was scarce. Families slept in one bed to share what little warmth their bodies could offer. Children curled up beside their parents. Dogs were welcomed onto straw beds. Livestock sometimes slept just feet away, their breath steaming in the same air. Modesty didn't matter. Cleanliness didn't matter. Only survival did. Imagine waking up before the sun, in the pitch-black silence of a medieval winter morning. Your breath fogs the air. The frost on the walls sparkles like tiny stars. You don't reach for a light switch or a heater. You pull your cloak tighter, shove your feet into frozen boots, and head outside to check the animals, because life doesn't stop for cold. This was the reality for millions who lived not so long ago. In this video, we are diving deep into that forgotten world. A world where staying warm was a daily battle, where every ember of fire mattered, and where surviving the coldest nights was an act of resilience. How did they do it? What tricks did they use? And what can we learn from the way they lived, endured, and adapted? Welcome to the frozen heart of history. This is how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights. Cuddling wasn't romantic. It was survival. In the heart of winter, when the winds howled like wolves across the open fields and snow blanketed every thatched roof and muddy road, medieval peasants faced a brutal truth. If they didn't prepare for the cold, they would die. The cold in those days wasn't something a person could simply wait out. It crept into your bones, turned your fingers blue, and made sleep feel like slipping into the arms of death. And for peasants, who had no fine wool cloaks or roaring hearths piled high with firewood, surviving those nights was an act of gritty, determined will. It wasn't about comfort. It was about raw survival. And that's why, when night fell, cuddling wasn't romantic. It was necessary. The peasant home was no sanctuary from the elements. It was a small, drafty structure made of wattle and daub with a thatched roof that offered little insulation against the biting cold. The floors were often just packed dirt, maybe covered with straw if the family was lucky. There was usually only one room where the family cooked, ate, worked, and slept together. If the family was especially poor, They might share their space with livestock, whose body heat served as a crude form of central heating. A cow in the corner of the room might be smelly, but when temperatures dipped below freezing, its presence might mean the difference between frostbite and warmth. Clothing offered little help. Most peasants owned just a few garments, and those were typically made of coarse wool or linen, materials that did little to fend off deep cold. Wool kept some warmth in, but it wasn't magic. When wet, which was often the case during snowy or rainy winters, it became heavy and cold. Mittens and socks were luxuries. Shoes were made from stiff leather, poorly fitted and easily soaked through. Nightwear, as we imagine it today, didn't exist. People slept in their clothes because taking them off could be deadly. The hearth was the heart of the home, but it was also a smoky, inconsistent source of heat. Firewood was precious. It had to be gathered, chopped, dried, and stored, and peasants often didn't have enough of it to burn through the night. The fire might be allowed to smolder low while everyone huddled nearby, wrapped in rough blankets or cloaks, doing everything they could to conserve the precious warmth before it faded away completely. In some cases, embers were banked under ashes to keep them alive until morning, when they could be stoked back into flame. Cuddling, or more accurately, group sleeping, was one of the few strategies that truly worked. Entire families would sleep in a single bed or on a shared pile of straw, pressed tightly together like animals in a burrow. Children, parents, even grandparents would pile in, forming a human furnace. This closeness wasn't about affection. It was about conserving every last bit of body heat. The more people packed into a small space, the more their combined warmth resisted the cold. People lay side by side, back to back, or curled against each other. There was no concept of personal space. Survival took precedence. Even the design of beds reflected the need for warmth. Peasant beds were often short, not because people were tiny, but because they slept curled up, knees to chest, minimizing surface area exposed to cold. Beds were sometimes boxed in with wooden panels or heavy curtains to trap heat like a miniature room within a room. Blankets and mattresses were filled with straw, wool, or even feathers if the family was lucky. But more often than not, it was the human bodies themselves that kept the bed warm. Sometimes, if a family had enough money, they might heat bricks or stones in the fire and place them in the bed before lying down. These crude bed warmers were wrapped in cloth and buried under blankets. But this too came with risks. Poorly wrapped stones could scorch skin or set the bedding on fire, especially in homes where most materials were flammable. Bathing during the winter was rare and often avoided altogether. Water was cold, hard to obtain, and risky. A wet body in a freezing house could lead to deadly chills. Hygiene was a secondary concern compared to warmth. Lice and fleas were constant companions, and bedding often crawled with them. But they were a lesser evil compared to the brutal bite of the frost. Diet also played a role in survival. Winter meals were simple, often bland, and focused on calories and warmth. Thick stews made from whatever root vegetables were left in storage, maybe a bit of dried meat, or lard if luck allowed, were simmered over the fire and eaten quickly. Warm meals helped the body maintain its temperature, even if just temporarily. Ale, served at room temperature and often thick with grain residue, was a common drink, not because it was particularly warming, but because it was safer than the often contaminated water. Peasants also followed the rhythms of nature. They woke late, slept early, and moved as little as possible during the coldest parts of the day. Work was necessary. Of course, animals still needed feeding, and chores could not be ignored, but every movement was calculated. Fingers numbed quickly, tools were hard to handle, and injury was a constant risk. A simple cut could become infected. A slip on ice could result in a broken bone that never healed properly. Sometimes, neighbors would come together for warmth. In some communities, the poorest might be taken in by others on the coldest nights. Communal survival instincts ran strong. People knew that losing even one set of hands to the cold was a blow to the entire village. So peasants practiced what might seem like generosity, but was really pragmatic mutual aid. A child sleeping alone in a corner of a freezing house might not make it to morning, but 3 or 4 children, nestled like puppies under a shared blanket, stood a better chance. There were also superstitions about cold, beliefs that spirits or demons roamed more freely on winter nights, especially when the frost was thick and the moon was high. Some people placed charms above their beds, uttered prayers, or burned bundles of herbs to ward off bad luck. Fear, it turned out, was another heat source, a motivator to stay vigilant, to huddle together, to survive. And yet, for all its harshness, winter also had its quiet moments. A frozen world meant less work in the fields, fewer tasks demanding attention. Families gathered closer. Stories were told, songs were sung, and simple games were played. The crackling fire, weak though it was, became the centerpiece of evening life. In that circle of dim light, surrounded by the dark and the cold, warmth became a shared act of resistance. Romance, in the way we think of it, was almost irrelevant. A man and woman lying close under the same blanket weren't necessarily engaging in anything more than survival. Love didn't blossom in the cold. It waited for spring. Winter was about making it through the night, not whispering sweet nothings. And yet, from that necessity came the intimacy of shared hardship, the kind that bound people not with poetry, but with pain and perseverance. For medieval peasants, the cold was a teacher. It taught the value of bodies pressed together, of shared meals and shared beds, of looking out for your neighbor, not out of kindness, but out of a desperate, ancient instinct to live. It taught patience, humility, and the hard-earned knowledge that warmth could not be taken for granted. So when the snow drifted high against the cottage walls and the wind sang its mournful song through every crack and gap, the peasants gathered close. They held their children, their parents, and each other. They pressed flesh to flesh, breath to breath. They slept in a tangle of limbs and straw and hopes. And when morning came, if they were lucky, they rose into a world still bitterly cold, but alive. Alive because they had learned the most important rule of medieval winter. Cuddling wasn't romantic. It was survival. Their homes were insulated with mud, dung, and straw. In the dead of winter, when the frost crept in through the cracks of poorly built homes and the winds howled like wolves outside, survival was not a given. For medieval peasants, the cold was not just a seasonal inconvenience. It was a test of resilience, a constant fight to keep bodies warm, children alive, and food from freezing. There were no radiators, no double-glazed windows, and certainly no hot water bottles. Their salvation came from materials most of us today would find disgusting or beneath us. But to them, it was the stuff of life. Mud, dung, and straw were their weapons in a battle against winter's wrath. Peasant homes in the Middle Ages were not made to impress. They were made to endure. The average house was a crude structure, often a single-room hut shared by an entire family, and sometimes even a few animals. Timber framed the walls, but the spaces in between were filled with what was known as wattle and daub. Wattle referred to woven wooden slats or branches, and daub was the mixture that held it all together. This was not some high-quality plaster. This was a mash of mud, straw, and animal dung. It was lathered on thick and left to dry, cracking in some places but sealing out wind in others. Dung might seem like a last resort, but for the medieval peasant, it was an incredibly practical choice. Animal droppings, especially from cows, were abundant, sticky, and surprisingly effective at trapping heat. When mixed with mud and straw, dung helped create a kind of medieval insulation that hardened into a fairly solid wall. It didn't just trap heat. It also kept out pests and even had antibacterial properties. In some villages, this mix was applied repeatedly in layers as winter approached. plugging any cracks and sealing in precious warmth. The smell, people say, faded with time, or perhaps became just another scent of daily life. Inside the homes, the floor was usually nothing more than packed earth. Cold and unforgiving, it absorbed the chill of the season and gave little back. Some families spread straw or rushes over it, not just for cleanliness, but for warmth. Over time, those rushes would mix with dirt, food scraps, and waste, forming a kind of mat that, though filthy, offered more insulation than bare ground. Some peasants took to laying animal skins over their bedding area to keep themselves from the damp. Others simply huddled together for warmth, entire families sleeping side by side like livestock in a barn. And often, that is precisely what they did, share space with animals. Chickens, goats, even pigs might be brought inside during the harshest months. Their body heat helped raise the interior temperature of the home, sometimes by several degrees. In the cramped space of a single-room cottage, every warm breath counted. The family might sleep in the same bed or on straw pallets nearby. It was not comfortable. It was not clean. But it worked. This intimacy, this merging of human and animal warmth, was one of the few defenses against bitter temperatures that could kill the old, the weak, and the very young. The hearth, always at the center of peasant life, became even more critical during the winter. A fire was kept burning as long as possible, often round the clock. Wood was a valuable resource, and not always easily available. In some areas, peasants had limited rights to collect dead wood from nearby forests, and they had to make do with what they could find. When firewood was scarce, dried dung cakes were used instead. Cow or horse droppings were collected, shaped, and dried in the sun during the summer months, then stored for use in winter. These dung cakes didn't burn as hot or as long as wood, but they provided enough warmth to take the edge off the cold. Smoke filled the room from the hearth. His chimneys were rare in most peasant homes. A simple hole in the roof let some smoke out, but much of it lingered inside. While this made breathing difficult and stung the eyes, it had an unintended benefit. Smoke helped preserve the wood of the house and acted as a kind of fumigant, discouraging insects and other pests. During long winters, that smoke also helped dry clothes hung from the rafters and lent a kind of warmth to the room even after the fire had died down. Clothing, too, played a crucial role. Peasants layered everything they had. Wool was the most common material, and it provided excellent insulation even when damp. Undergarments made of linen helped wick sweat away from the body, and cloaks, often passed down through generations, were used like mobile blankets. Hoods and caps were rarely removed indoors, even while sleeping. Shoes were stuffed with straw, rags, or moss. Every bit of material was used to cover exposed skin. Gloves and socks were luxuries. More often, peasants simply wrapped their hands and feet in layers of fabric, tied at the ends with bits of string or leather. Outside, survival meant preparation. Wood needed to be chopped and stored. Food had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or drying. Water sources were insulated as best they could be, with thatch or bundled straw to keep them from freezing entirely. But no matter how well prepared they were, the cold always found a way in. For many, winter was a time of endurance, where death was never far from the hearth. Children who fell ill with fevers often didn't make it to spring. The elderly succumbed to the cold in their sleep. Even the animals, who were so vital to survival, could perish if not properly sheltered. Yet there was a strange kind of warmth in community. Villagers helped one another, especially during storms. If a family's roof collapsed under snow, neighbors would come with mud, straw, and whatever tools they had. Communal efforts built homes, but they also saved lives. In some villages, peasants gathered at the manor's kitchen or the local church on the coldest nights, places that were better built and sometimes heated more consistently. These were not acts of generosity from the wealthy lords. They were social norms, part of the feudal contract that, while exploitative, demanded a certain amount of care for the peasants who kept the land alive. As the winter days dragged on, time slowed. Work in the fields was impossible. Instead, peasants mended tools, spun wool, told stories, and prayed. Life narrowed to the routines of survival. Waking up meant immediately tending the fire, checking on the animals, and shuffling through cold mud to relieve oneself outside or in a crude corner privy. Meals were meager stews of beans, cabbage, and turnips, cooked all day in a pot over the fire, thickening slowly, offering warmth, if not flavor. There was very little light, as candles were expensive, and windows, if they existed at all, were usually nothing more than slits or covered in oiled cloth. Most activity ended shortly after sundown. The night belonged to the cold. People crawled under layers of blankets, cloaks, and anything else that could trap heat. Children clung to their parents. Dogs curled against legs. Sleep was uneasy, interrupted by coughing, the crackle of fire, or the sharp chill of an early morning breeze slipping through a gap in the wall. Despite all this, medieval peasants endured. Their ingenuity with mud, dung, and straw was not born of innovation, but of necessity. They took what the world gave them and turned it into something that worked. Their homes may not have been beautiful. They may not have smelled fresh, but they were warm enough to keep death at bay. And in a world where one bad harvest or a week of freezing rain could mean starvation or ruin, that warmth was everything. So when we imagine medieval peasants huddled in their simple cottages, we should not see them as pitiful or backward. We should see them as survivors, people who fought the elements with nothing but their hands and their knowledge of the land. They built homes with the muck of the earth, lived shoulder to shoulder with beasts, and kept the flame alive through the darkest nights. Mud, dung, and straw were not symbols of filth. They were the architecture of endurance, the materials of survival, and the quiet genius of a people who knew what it took to outlast the winter. The hearth was the heart of the home. In the biting chill of a medieval winter, long before central heating or insulated walls, survival was a test of ingenuity, endurance, and community. For the average peasant, life was already a daily struggle for food, work, and safety. But winter brought a new layer of hardship. The cold could creep in like a predator, slipping through thatched roofs and seeping through poorly fitted wooden planks. Yet even in this unforgiving season, medieval peasants found a way to survive. And at the center of it all stood the hearth. Not just a place to cook or warm your hands, the hearth was the very soul of a peasant's home. It was where life happened, where stories were told, where bread was baked, and most importantly, where cold was kept at bay. A peasant's cottage was usually a single-room structure, modest and dim, its walls made of wattle and daub or rough-hewn logs, with gaps that the wind could whisper through. The thatched roof above might sag under snow and was always at risk of catching fire from the open flames within. Windows, if they existed at all, were simple holes covered in cloth or animal hide, not glass. In such a setting, the hearth was everything. It was dug into the center of the room or built against one wall, with smoke escaping through a simple hole in the roof or an open gable. A chimney was a luxury only wealthier homes possessed. Inside, the smoke often lingered, coating everything in soot, but that thick smoke had its hidden benefits. It killed insects nesting in the roof and even preserved the timbers overhead. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the cold pressed harder against the thin walls, the hearth was the only thing standing between life and a frozen night. Families would huddle around it, not just for warmth, but for light. Candles were precious and rare, so the fire provided the only illumination after dark. It was the center of evening rituals. A stew pot might hang over the flames, bubbling with the meager contents of the day's hunt or harvest. Root vegetables, herbs, and the occasional bit of salted meat became supper, shared by hand from wooden bowls. Children sat close to the fire, wrapped in cloaks or wool blankets, listening to the elders' tales and the crackling of the flames. The fire was never allowed to die. Even at night, someone would be tasked with tending it, feeding it with scraps of peat, wood, or dried animal dung, whatever fuel could be scrounged. In many households, embers were banked at night beneath ashes to keep them alive until morning. Restarting a fire from scratch was not easy and could be dangerous in the wrong hands. Keeping it smoldering through the dark hours was a survival tactic passed down through generations. Peasant homes weren't just heated by fire. They were organized around it. Animals, essential to the family's livelihood, were sometimes brought indoors for the night, sharing warmth in a surprisingly communal fashion. A goat or chicken might sleep just a few feet away from the family's straw bedding. The body heat of animals added just enough warmth to fight off the chill, and they were kept safe from predators and thieves. Clothing became a second skin during winter. Peasants dressed in layers of wool, linen, and fur if they could afford it. Cloaks were heavy and coarse, sometimes shared between family members, and boots were stuffed with straw for insulation. But clothes alone could not protect them through the long, frozen nights. Many families would sleep in a pile, huddled together on straw beds covered with animal hides and old garments. The concept of personal space did not exist in such times. Warmth came from closeness, and everyone knew that survival depended on staying together. Work did not cease in winter. There was wood to chop, animals to feed, and if one was lucky, game to hunt. But shorter days and longer nights meant more time indoors. Women often spun wool by the firelight, while men carved tools or mended gear. Children helped or played nearby, their breath visible in the chill air if the fire had died too low. Laughter and storytelling became winter pastimes. Oral traditions flourished by the hearth. Songs were sung, local legends retold, and superstitions passed on with hushed reverence. The hearth was not just a source of heat, it was a wellspring of culture. But the fire was not always enough. In the harshest winters, when fuel ran low and bellies were empty, the cold could claim lives. The elderly and infants were the most vulnerable, and it was not uncommon for families to wake and find a loved one had not made it through the night. In these moments, the hearth became a place of mourning. It stood silently as grief rippled through the room, offering its dim glow in sympathy. Those who lived near forests or had access to peat bogs fared better. They could collect fuel more readily and keep their fires brighter and hotter. Others might barter for wood or dung, trading eggs, wool, or labor. The desperation of winter often reshuffled the social order of a village. Cooperation became more valuable than pride. Neighbors might share a fire or take turns hosting meals. The strong helped the weak, and the weak returned the favor in whatever way they could. Peasants also practiced simple but clever strategies to keep warm. Heated stones were sometimes wrapped in cloth and placed under blankets. People made use of draft stoppers, bundles of rags, placed at the bottoms of doors or around windows to keep out the wind. Some buried hot coals under their bedding, though this was risky and could lead to burns or fires. Still, it showed how resourceful people became when fighting the cold. Even in sleep, the threat of cold lingered. Dreams were often interrupted by coughing, wheezing, and the creaks of settling timber. But through it all, the hearth remained their guardian. It demanded attention, labor, and respect. Neglecting it could spell disaster. But as long as the flames flickered and the smoke curled upward, there was hope. In its glow, people found strength. As dawn approached, the first to rise would stir the embers back into life. A few careful puffs of breath, a sprinkle of dry twigs, and the hearth would awaken once more, casting orange light across sleeping faces. The day would begin with warmth, however modest, and the cycle would continue. There was no time to lament the cold. There were chores to do, mouths to feed, and a fire to keep alive. Surviving winter as a medieval peasant meant more than just braving the elements. It meant knowing how to make every scrap of warmth count. It meant being part of a family and a community that understood the dangers and faced them together. The hearth was more than a fire pit. It was the family's lifeline, a symbol of resilience in a world that offered little comfort. Around its flames, peasants fought back against the season that tried to silence them. And in that small circle of heat and light, they endured. Beds were stuffed with straw and tucked into alcoves. When winter settled over the medieval countryside like a heavy woolen cloak, peasants had to find ways to survive that were more clever than comfortable. The bitter wind had no mercy, and the stone and timber walls of their humble homes were poor protection against it. Firewood was scarce, and the cold could bite through even the thickest homespun. Yet somehow, families managed to endure the long, freezing nights, huddled together in their simple dwellings. Among their greatest tools for survival was something that might not look like much to modern eyes: their beds. Stuffed with straw and tucked tightly into alcoves, these beds were more than just a place to sleep. They were survival pods, hand-built havens from the winter chill. A medieval peasant's house was not built for luxury. Most homes had a single room, maybe two if the family was particularly lucky. The floors were often packed earth, the walls of wattle and daub interwoven wooden sticks, coated with a paste of clay, mud, straw, and sometimes even dung. Insulation, as we think of it today, was almost non-existent. Cold crept in through every gap, and a stiff breeze could flutter the rushes on the floor or blow smoke back down the chimney. In such an environment, finding a way to retain warmth during the night was critical. A fire helped, of course, but it could not burn all night long, and many peasants could not afford to keep feeding it through the dark hours. That left the bed as their last and best defense. The construction of a peasant bed was simple but smart. Wooden frames were a luxury, and many slept directly on mattresses laid over wooden pallets or even just on the floor. The mattress itself was a large sack, usually sewn from coarse linen or burlap, stuffed full of straw, reeds, or dried leaves. In late autumn, before the weather turned too harsh, families would gather and dry fresh straw for the coming winter. It wasn't the softest material, and it flattened quickly, but it provided a critical layer of insulation between the sleeper and the cold ground. The straw trapped body heat and kept out the chill that seeped up from below. These straw mattresses were not simply plopped down in the middle of a drafty room. In many medieval homes, beds were built into small alcoves or recessed into walls. The idea was ingenious by enclosing the bed on three sides, and sometimes even adding a curtain or wooden shutter to the front. They could create a tiny pocket of warmth. The alcove bed acted like a cocoon. Once a person climbed inside, their body heat would warm the small enclosed space, and the warmth would stay trapped longer. The curtains or doors were not for privacy. They were for survival. Closing off the bed alcove from the larger, colder room could mean the difference between a shivering, miserable night and a passable sleep. Families did not sleep alone in these beds. Entire households often crammed together for warmth. Parents and children would pile into a single straw-filled mattress tucked inside an alcove, pressed shoulder to shoulder under thick wool blankets or even animal pelts. Sleeping this way was not a choice, it was a necessity. One person's body heat could barely keep the cold at bay, but several together could build up enough warmth to make the night bearable. In the dead of winter, even livestock like chickens or young goats might be brought indoors to share the warmth, sometimes resting just beneath the sleeping platform. Blankets were precious and not always plentiful. A single woolen cover might be shared among several people, so peasants layered whatever they had: rough-spun cloaks, patched garments, worn linens, and animal hides. Some even slept in their clothes, which in winter could be stiff with dirt and sweat, but still offered a barrier against the cold. Cleanliness was a lower priority than survival. Washing meant stripping down, and stripping down in winter meant risking frostbite. So they stayed bundled, slept close, and relied on their clever bed design to keep out the night. The practice of tucking beds into alcoves became more common in colder regions, where long winters were the norm. In parts of northern Europe, such as Scotland, Scandinavia, and the Low Countries, the alcove bed developed into the box bed, a wooden enclosure with a door or panel that shut the sleeper inside like a cupboard. While this was more of a luxury than what most English or French peasants could afford, the principle was the same. Enclose the bed, trap the heat, survive the night. Bedtime routines were centered around this goal of preserving warmth. Before climbing into bed, peasants might sit near the hearth for a final dose of heat, letting the fire warm their bones while they ate a thin broth or drank a small mug of ale. The fire would then be banked covered with ashes to keep the embers smoldering until morning. Then it was off to bed, with the youngest children put in first, nestled deep into the warmest corner. The elders followed, slipping under the covers quickly to avoid letting out too much heat. Once everyone was in place, the curtain or panel would be drawn, and the little sleeping world would fall into a chilly but bearable stillness. For many families, there was an unspoken rhythm to surviving the coldest nights. It started before the frost came, in the gathering of straw and the patching of linens. It continued through the long winter, in the maintenance of the fire, the care of the bedding, and the nightly ritual of bundling close. The bed was not just furniture. It was a strategy. It was their stronghold against the cold. And each morning, when they emerged from the alcove, blinking into the pale light of a winter sun, they carried with them the quiet pride of having made it through one more night. Peasant life was brutal in its simplicity. Every scrap of fabric had a purpose. Every structural choice in the home was dictated by need. The hearth gave warmth, but the bed preserved it. Even something as humble as a pile of straw, if used wisely, could be the barrier between life and death. The ingenuity of these sleeping arrangements reflected a broader truth about medieval peasant life. They survived not through comfort, but through cleverness and community. The straw would need replacing by spring, when dampness and vermin had their way with it. But by then, the danger of the long cold nights would have passed. Fresh air would return to the land, fires would be less urgent, and peasants could look forward to longer days and warmer evenings. But even in the warmth of spring, they would remember the tight little alcoves, the scratchy blankets, and the soft rustle of straw beneath their backs. They would remember how they survived together. This was the rhythm of the seasons. This was the rhythm of survival. And the humble bed stuffed with straw, hidden in an alcove, warmed by the breath of family, was the very heart of that rhythm. It was not luxury, but it was life. And in the depths of a medieval winter, that made all the difference. They slept fully clothed, sometimes in layers. In the dead of winter, when the wind howled like a living thing through the cracks in the wattle and daub and the hearth, fire burned low for lack of fuel. The only warmth a medieval peasant could truly rely on was the heat of their own body. There was no such thing as central heating or thick window panes to keep the cold out. A medieval peasant's home was more like a drafty shelter than a secure refuge. Yet somehow, despite the biting chill and the unforgiving frost, they managed to survive night after night, one of the most essential tools in their battle against the cold. They slept fully clothed, sometimes in multiple layers. To understand why this practice became so common, one must first imagine the conditions these peasants lived in. Their homes were small, single-room huts, often shared with animals for extra body heat. The floor was usually dirt or rough planks, and the roof was made of thatch. While thatch was surprisingly good at insulating against rain and sun, it was no match for the bitter winds of winter. Gaps between walls and ceilings were common, and the chill found every crack and crevice. Even when the fire in the hearth was roaring, the heat struggled to fill the space. Once the flames died down for the night, the temperature plummeted. Clothing, therefore, was not simply a daytime affair. It was armor against the elements, and peeling it off before bed would have been downright foolish. So they did not. A peasant might go to sleep wearing the same tunic, hose, undershirt, and woolen overcoat they had worked in all day. If they were fortunate enough to have more than one layer, they would pile it on, donning extra shirts or wrapping themselves in any scrap of fabric they could find. Clothes were rarely washed in winter due to the freezing temperatures, and they grew stiff and grimy, but hygiene came second to survival. It was not uncommon for peasants to sleep in their cloaks. These heavy, woven garments, often fastened with a wooden or bone clasp at the neck, offered additional insulation. Cloaks were not decorative luxuries, but essential tools for staying alive. A good cloak could be the difference between shivering through the night and actually sleeping soundly. Some even used them like blankets, especially if the family was sharing a bed and needed to stretch whatever covering they had. Sleeping fully clothed meant that bedtime preparation was quick. There were no warm baths to ease into, no fresh linen to change into. A medieval peasant might warm their hands by the fire, say a prayer, and then crawl directly into bed in whatever state they were in. Often, the bed was little more than a pile of straw, covered with a rough woolen blanket or a hide. If lucky, this straw might be stuffed into a cloth mattress. But regardless of its form, the bed offered little in the way of warmth on its own. Body heat was the only real source of heat, and preserving it was crucial. Children, parents, even grandparents might all sleep in the same bed to share warmth. Modesty took a back seat to necessity. This family pile was a medieval version of insulation, each body radiating a small amount of heat that, collectively, kept everyone from freezing. In harsher winters, animals such as dogs or even lambs might be brought indoors and allowed to sleep close to the humans. Their breath and bodies added valuable warmth, especially when temperatures dropped below freezing. But even within this tight arrangement, layering clothing was key. Many peasants wore linen undershirts beneath their tunics, a simple but crucial addition that trapped body heat and added a thin barrier between rough wool and skin. Wool, though itchy, was a favorite for outer garments because it retained heat even when damp. If they had access to them, some might stuff extra bits of wool or straw into their clothes for added padding. Every bit helped. If one layer could not fend off the chill, 2 or 3 might. Some also fashioned makeshift head coverings from spare cloth. The head loses a lot of heat, and even a simple woolen cap or hood could make the difference between a night of restless shivering and some measure of comfort. Socks, if they owned any, would stay on. If not, feet might be wrapped in cloth or tucked under a sibling or spouse. Cold feet could be the bane of winter sleep, and peasants had to get creative. Interestingly, sleeping fully clothed also had a psychological benefit. Waking up cold and sluggish in the early hours to start chores in an icy hut would have been even worse if one had to wrestle stiff clothes onto a freezing body. By sleeping in their work garments, peasants could simply rise and get to it. The moment they emerged from under their shared blanket, the frigid air would bite into any exposed skin. The fewer moments spent naked, the better. Winter nights were long, sometimes stretching up to 14 hours. Firewood was a precious commodity, and peasants could not afford to keep a blaze going all night. That meant that most of the evening, especially the early morning hours, were spent in darkness and cold. To reduce exposure, people often went to bed shortly after sunset and remained under their covers as long as possible. Sleeping fully clothed made these extended periods in bed more tolerable. But this way of life was not without its drawbacks. Clothes rarely had time to dry if they got wet, and mold or mildew could set in. Lice, fleas, and other pests flourished in layers of unwashed fabric. Skin rashes and infections were common, and the constant friction of rough materials wore at the body. Still, these discomforts were preferable to freezing. Survival demanded trade-offs, and medieval peasants knew all too well that comfort was a luxury they could not afford. There were, of course, regional variations. In some areas, wealthier peasants or freemen might own a second set of garments or a slightly better insulated home. In warmer regions, the severity of winter might be lessened. But in northern Europe, where snow and frost reigned supreme from November to March, sleeping fully clothed was a universal truth. For many, winter survival was also spiritual. Cold and darkness were associated with danger and evil. Prayers before bed were common, not only for protection from illness or raiders, but also to ask God to watch over them through the freezing night. The cold was not just physical, it was symbolic of death. To make it through winter was to win a small battle against the elements, to defy nature's harshest test. Over time, these habits became part of the culture. Sleeping in layers was handed down through generations, along with other bits of cold weather wisdom. You could not control the weather, but you could prepare for it. Parents wrapped their children tightly, taught them how to tuck their tunic between their legs to retain warmth, and reminded them to keep their feet dry. These were the survival lessons of the peasant world's simple, intuitive, born of hard experience. So the next time you pull on your fleece pajamas or burrow under a heated blanket, remember the peasant families huddled in a straw bed, wrapped in layers of rough wool and day-old grime clinging to each other and to life. Their survival depended not on comfort, but on resilience, adaptation, and the wisdom of generations who had learned to endure the cold by sleeping in every piece of clothing they owned. It was not about fashion, hygiene, or even modesty. It was about surviving the night with nothing but the clothes on your back and the warmth of those beside you. Animals slept inside for warmth. When winter gripped the medieval countryside, life turned brutal for those who lived in its grasp. The cold was not just uncomfortable, it was lethal. For peasants who had neither wealth nor luxury, surviving the long frozen nights required creativity, resilience, and a complete disregard for what modern people might call boundaries. One of their most reliable strategies was also the most peculiar to modern sensibilities. They brought the animals inside. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens, all of them. They did not sleep in barns far from the family hearth. They slept next to the family, in the same room, on the same dirt floor, not out of affection, not because animals were beloved companions, because their body heat could keep a family alive. A peasant's home was no fortress against the elements. It was a humble structure built from wattle and daub, a paste of mud and straw smeared over woven wood panels. The roof was made of thatch, often leaking and vulnerable to snow and rain. There was usually just one room, maybe two if the family was slightly better off. And there was no insulation, no glass in the windows, no real separation between the world outside and the freezing interior. The biting cold seeped through every crack and crevice, turning the interior of the house into little more than a glorified refrigerator during the worst of the season. In that small space, the entire family lived, ate, worked, and slept. And in the heart of winter, so did their animals. The logic was simple. Animals give off heat. Large animals like cows and pigs radiate warmth. They can raise the temperature of a room, however slightly. That tiny margin could mean everything. It could mean a child waking up with a cough instead of never waking up at all. So the animals were welcomed indoors. Often the structure of the peasant house made room for this setup. In many regions, particularly across northern and central Europe, homes were built with an open layout that included a slightly sunken area at one end, called a byre, specifically for animals. A low wall or wooden partition might separate the animals from the human living space, but in many cases there was no real barrier. The smell, the noise, and the filth all came with them, but so did the heat. The manure and sweat and warm breath of livestock turned the icy interior into something just tolerable enough to survive. Imagine the scene as night fell. The fire in the hearth was banked low, the last glow of embers casting flickering shadows on the walls. The family huddled together on beds of straw or rough cloth. In the corner, or perhaps just a few feet away, a cow shifted and snorted, her heavy body radiating warmth. A pig burrowed into a pile of hay, grunting softly in sleep. Chickens clucked in their sleep, their feathers puffed up for insulation. Everyone in that cramped room, human and beast alike, was a heat source, and every degree mattered. There was no privacy. There was no concept of cleanliness as we understand it today. Peasants understood that living with animals meant lice, fleas, and a constant battle against the stench of dung and wet fur. But when your very survival depends on staying warm, you learn to live with those discomforts. In fact, you learn to rely on them. The animals, too, benefited from this arrangement. Barns in those days were little more than lean-tos or sheds with open walls and thatch for a roof. They offered some protection from the snow and rain, but did little to stop the wind or the cold. Many a farmer learned the hard way that livestock left outside could freeze to death in the night. Bringing the animals inside was a way of protecting both them and the family that depended on them. A cow was not just a source of milk. She was a vital part of the household economy. A dead cow meant no milk, no butter, no calves, no meat. It was a disaster. So the animal was brought indoors, treated like a rough-hewn member of the family out of necessity. And the warmth was not just physical. Animals offered psychological comfort as well. Their breathing, their sounds, their familiar presence made the cold nights feel a little less empty. When the world outside was frozen and silent, the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of feathers, and the occasional sleepy grunt reminded the peasant family that they were not alone in the dark. In a time when wolves roamed the edges of villages and superstition cloaked the night in fear, that presence meant peace of mind. It is worth imagining what it smelled like inside those homes. The scent of unwashed bodies, smoke from the hearth, wet wool, and manure blended into something overpowering to modern noses. But for the medieval peasant, that was simply life. The stench was not a sign of filth. It was a sign of warmth. It meant the animals were alive, the fire still burned, and the family had made it through another night. Children grew up with this way of life. They played beside goats and chased chickens across the floor. They were used to sharing their sleeping space with creatures that modern children only saw on farms. Some would even sleep pressed against the side of a cow, stealing warmth from the animal's broad, living body. If there were puppies or lambs born in the winter, they too might be brought inside, cradled close by children, or placed near the fire in baskets. The line between domestic and barnyard was blurry at best. Firewood was precious and in short supply. Forests were often protected by local lords, and peasants could be fined or punished for gathering too much. That meant most families could not afford to keep a roaring fire through the night. Instead, they banked the coals, covered them with ash to preserve the heat, and let the warmth of bodies do the rest. Human bodies, animal bodies, it made no difference. It was all part of the same strategy. Even chickens played a role. While not particularly warm compared to pigs or cows, their feathers and movements brought life to the home. In some places, families constructed wooden perches or small coops indoors to keep their hens safe from predators and the cold. Eggs were a vital food source, especially in lean months when meat was scarce. Protecting the hens meant protecting the family's breakfast. In some regions, certain customs evolved to make this arrangement more manageable. Bedding was layered with straw and replaced regularly, helping to soak up some of the moisture and waste. Strong herbs like sage or lavender might be burned to mask the smell or discourage fleas. Still, none of it made the experience clean. It only made it survivable. The animals were not seen as friends in the modern sense. They were workers, food sources, and heat providers. There might have been affection, but it was shaped by necessity, not sentiment. A piglet might be named, and a cow might be treated with kindness, but everyone knew that eventually the animal would be slaughtered or sold. Until then, though, they were part of the household, pulling their weight like everyone else. This way of life created a unique closeness between humans and animals. It was born from mutual need and the harsh lessons of cold winters. The idea of kicking a dog outside for the night would have been absurd to a medieval peasant. Every warm body mattered. Every breath counted. Survival depended on abandoning modern ideas of space, privacy, and cleanliness. It was not idyllic. It was not quaint. It was rough, raw, and practical. The winter wind did not care about your preferences. It howled down the chimneys and through the shutters all the same. The only answer was to gather everything warm, everything living, and hold it close. People, animals, fires, embers bundled together in one shivering organism of survival. And somehow it worked. Despite the odds, despite the brutal conditions, medieval peasants endured. They emerged from winter leaner, wearier, but alive. They survived because they adapted, because they turned their homes into strange, smelly ecosystems of life and heat, because they let the cow sleep by the door and the pig burrow into the straw beside the bed, because they understood, better than we often do today, that survival sometimes means embracing the things we would otherwise push away. So when the snow drifted against the door and the wind clawed at the thatch, they didn't light another log. They brought the animals inside. Not out of love, out of survival. They burned peat, twigs, and dung when wood was scarce. When winter settled in and the land turned to frost and silence, medieval peasants faced a cruel and unrelenting enemy. The cold was not something to be enjoyed or marveled at. It was a creeping danger that slithered through every crack in a peasant's home and sank into their bones. It stole away livestock. It shriveled crops left too long in the fields. It took the youngest and the oldest without mercy. And in this frozen world, one element stood between life and death: fire. But when wood was scarce, as it so often was, fire became a desperate pursuit. The answer did not lie in grand hearths or stacks of chopped oak. It lay in peat, twigs, and dung. Anything that would burn became sacred. Anything that produced heat, no matter how foul or faint, became fuel for survival. In the countryside, peasants did not always have the right to chop down trees. Forests were often owned by lords, kings, or the church, and gathering firewood without permission could lead to punishment. Even when dead wood was technically allowed, the demand far outweighed the supply. Entire villages depended on the same small woodland stretches. By the time snow fell, much of the forest floor had already been picked clean. In some places, there was no forest at all, just open farmland, stone, and sky. So peasants had to get creative. Peat was one of the most precious alternatives. Found in boggy areas and moors, peat is a dense mass of partially decayed vegetation, pressed and compacted over centuries. To the medieval peasant, it was a kind of buried treasure. Digging for peat was backbreaking work, often done in late summer or early autumn before the ground froze. Peasants would cut long, brick-like chunks from the bog and stack them to dry. It could take weeks for the wet peat to become light and dry enough to burn. When it did, it gave off a slow, smoldering heat and a strong, earthy smell. It didn't burn with the brightness or crackle of wood, but it could last through the night. And that was what mattered most. In regions like Ireland and parts of Scotland, peat was more than just a supplement. It was the primary source of fuel. Families passed down the knowledge of the best digging spots. Children learned how to stack peat bricks to dry just right, shielding them from sudden rain. The smell of burning peat became part of the winter landscape, curling out of the smoke holes in cottages and lingering in woolen clothes. Inside, the heat it gave off was steady but slow. It took time to warm a room, but it could keep the chill at bay for hours. Families would sit close to the hearth, hands outstretched, the fire barely more than a dull glow in the center of their world. In other places where peat was not available, twigs became the next best thing. While large branches and tree trunks were often off limits or simply unavailable, twigs could be gathered more freely. Children and elderly villagers would go out and comb the land, collecting armfuls of small branches, dry leaves, bark, and anything that could catch a spark. It was a constant task. A fire needed more than just one good burn. It needed to be fed over and over, especially during the long, frigid nights. A single forgotten twig pile could mean the difference between waking up stiff with cold or not waking at all. Twigs burned fast and hot, flaring up in brief bursts before dying down again. Peasants learned to layer them carefully, using dry moss or bark to start the fire, then adding thicker sticks in a slow rhythm. They might mix twigs with dried dung to stretch the burn time. A good fire was like gold. It warmed the home, cooked the meal, dried wet clothes, and even provided light for the small bits of work that could still be done after sundown. Spinning wool, sewing, carving, and repairing tools all happened by firelight in winter. A hearth was not just the physical center of the house. It was the spiritual one. A fire meant life. But dung was the fuel of the truly resourceful. Every peasant family with livestock knew the value of animal droppings. Cow dung, in particular, was prized. It was plentiful, sticky enough to be shaped, and dried into firm, burnable patties. These dung cakes were collected daily, shaped by hand, and left out to dry on stone walls or rooftops in the sun. By the time the first frost came, the family would have a stack ready to go. It wasn't glamorous. The smell lingered long after the flames died out. But it worked. Dung burned longer than twigs and was more accessible than wood. It could keep a pot simmering, keep a child warm, and keep death away from the doorstep. Hearths that burned dung were smoky and pungent. The interior of peasant cottages would grow dark with soot over the winter months. Walls blackened. Rafters collected thick ribbons of smoke. But that smoke also helped in other ways. It preserved the wood beams of the house and kept pests away. It was a dirty kind of protection, but it was protection all the same. The smoke crept into woolen cloaks and tunics. It left its mark on every corner of the home. And yet, to a peasant, the smell of burning dung was not foul. It was familiar. It meant warmth. It meant survival. Peasants knew how to stretch the smallest flames into something that could last. Stones were sometimes heated in the fire and then placed under bedding or near the feet at night. Clay pots filled with embers were buried beneath straw for added warmth. Some families even built their homes with fire efficiency in mind, arranging their single room so that the fire could reach every corner. People slept close together, not out of affection, but necessity. A family might curl up on a straw pallet, wrapped in wool and rags, their only heat coming from the shared warmth of bodies and the faint glow of dung embers. They learned to prepare early. In autumn, gathering fuel was as urgent as gathering food. Everyone helped. Children learned to spot good peat, pick dry twigs, and avoid damp dung. The entire village hummed with activity, preparing not for festivities, but for survival. By the time the ground froze, their stockpiles had to be ready. If they ran out of fuel in midwinter, there was no way to get more. The snow made the land impassable. The trees, if they were even allowed to approach them, stood silent and empty. The fields lay dead under a blanket of white. Fuel was not a luxury. It was a countdown. Every burned twig or peat brick was one less between you and the next thaw. Peasants also shared resources when possible. If one family had too little, neighbors might bring a handful of twigs or offer a peat brick in exchange for food or wool. These exchanges were not always kind or generous, but they were part of the social fabric that kept villages from collapsing in on themselves. Lords rarely provided direct aid in winter. They might offer access to part of a forest or leave the church fires going a little longer. But for the most part, peasants were left to their own devices. They survived not through charity, but through cleverness and sheer grit. The cold was cruel. It invaded the bones, turned breath into mist, and froze fingers so thoroughly that even the fire took hours to thaw them. And yet the peasant world endured. They built their lives from earth and waste, from twigs and mud, from everything others threw away. In that frozen silence, in the long hours of darkness, their fires burned on. Dim, smoky, and foul-smelling, perhaps, but burning all the same. So when you imagine a medieval peasant huddled by a low hearth, wrapped in wool, staring into a smoky fire fed by peat and dung, do not see them as defeated. See them as warriors against the elements. See them as engineers of survival, coaxing heat from the least likely of places. Their lives were carved from hardship, and their victories were small. But every night they lived through was one more defiance against the cold that sought to silence them. In a world where wood was scarce and warmth could not be taken for granted, they found a way. They dug into bogs. They gathered what others overlooked. They shaped fuel from waste and flame from nothing. And in doing so, they kept their families alive through the darkest nights of the year. Windows were covered with oiled cloth or shutters. In the long nights of medieval winter, when frost clung to the trees and breath turned to mist inside the home, the cold was more than an inconvenience. It was a persistent and dangerous force, one that could sap your strength and steal your life while you slept. For medieval peasants, whose homes were fragile bulwarks against nature, the cold season brought a test of endurance that would last for months. Their walls were thin, their roofs often leaked, and most strikingly, their windows offered no protection at all, unless they took matters into their own hands. In this fight against the cold, something as simple as oiled cloth or wooden shutters could mean the difference between surviving the night and not waking up at all. Medieval peasant homes were simple, one-room dwellings built for function, not comfort. Constructed from timber, wattle, and daub, or sometimes stone if one was lucky, these cottages were put together with what the land could offer. Roofs were usually thatched, floors were dirt, and furniture was minimal. There were no glass windows. Glass was far too expensive, reserved for churches and castles and the homes of nobility. For the peasant family trying to make it through the brutal winter, a window was nothing more than a hole in the wall. A hole that let in the wind, the snow, and the bitter cold. Leaving such an opening exposed could quickly turn a home into a freezer. The solution, though crude, was clever. Pieces of cloth soaked in oil or animal fat were hung over these openings to act as makeshift windows. The oil gave the fabric a degree of translucence and helped repel water. Light could still filter in, though dim and yellowed, but the worst of the wind and dampness were kept out. These coverings weren't perfect. They fluttered in storms, they stiffened in the frost, and they had to be maintained constantly. But they were a lifeline. They were the difference between a manageable chill and a biting draft that would crawl down your spine as you tried to sleep. Others used wooden shutters, planks crudely nailed together and fastened to the outside of the window hole. These were more durable, but offered no light. In the day, the shutters might be opened to let in the weak winter sun, but by nightfall, they would be pulled shut, latched tightly to keep the cold out. These shutters had to be built and maintained by the household themselves. There was no carpentry shop, no hardware store. If your shutter broke, you fixed it with what little wood or rope you had. In places where wood was scarce, the task became even more difficult. But necessity bred innovation. Old wagon carts, broken furniture, even bundles of straw soaked in mud might be repurposed to cover a window hole. Inside, the peasant family did everything they could to trap heat. The hearth in the center of the home was the only source of warmth. Every little bit of that heat had to be preserved. Covering windows was step one, But it didn't stop there. Gaps in the walls were stuffed with moss, rags, or mud. Animal hides were nailed to drafty spots. The door, often just a plank on hinges, might be backed with a thick cloth curtain. There were no luxuries here, only resourcefulness and the will to make a fragile shelter withstand the ferocity of the season. When the coldest nights came, the family would gather close. They wore every layer of clothing they owned: wool, linen, sometimes furs, if they were fortunate enough to trade for them. Children were wrapped in old cloaks or blankets patched together from worn tunics. People slept huddled, their bodies sharing heat. The entire household, including livestock on occasion, stayed under one roof. Chickens, pigs, even goats might be brought inside to prevent them from freezing or being stolen in the night. Their presence helped raise the temperature slightly, and though the smell and noise were less than pleasant, warmth was more important than comfort. The oiled cloth over the windows, while fragile, added psychological comfort too. It made the home feel sealed, complete, defended. Looking through it was like peering through wax paper. The outside world became a blur, a dark shape moving behind a yellow haze. But when snow blew across the fields or rain lashed at the roof, the family inside could huddle around the hearth and feel that they had, at least in some small way, protected themselves from nature's wrath. At night, the shutters were latched, the cloth drawn tight, and prayers whispered under blankets. The fire would be banked low with ashes to smolder until morning. No one dared let it go out. Relighting a fire from scratch was time-consuming and sometimes impossible if the materials were wet. Without a fire, even with covered windows and blocked doors, the house would chill to the bone before dawn. On especially cold nights, when the wind howled like wolves across the village, sleep was light and uneasy. Parents often stayed half awake, listening to the breathing of their children, checking the fire, adjusting the coverings on the windows to stop drafts. There was no sense of luxury, only duty. Each night was a small battle for survival. The fabric on the window might freeze stiff. The shutter might rattle loose. A particularly cruel gust might blow through a chink in the wall, sending everyone scrambling to plug the gap. Daylight brought some relief, but not warmth. The sun was weak in winter, and work still had to be done. Firewood had to be gathered, food prepared, and water fetched, often from frozen wells or streams. But the window coverings stayed in place. Only when it was safe and necessary did someone unlatch the shutter to peer outside. The world beyond was white and still, but danger always lingered. Wolves roamed in search of livestock. Bandits, too, might exploit the winter stillness, knowing that travel was difficult and help far away. The covered window served another purpose. It shielded those inside from unwanted eyes. Evenings returned quickly. The window was again shuttered, and the family once more circled the fire. They cooked a thin stew, spun wool, shared stories, and sang songs. These acts weren't just distractions. They were survival mechanisms. Keeping spirits up, keeping hands busy, keeping the mind from dwelling on the cold outside and the hunger in your belly. Children were taught to respect the window coverings as much as the fire. Never open them unnecessarily. Never damage the cloth. Never leave a shutter unlatched. These were rules that ensured the family survived. Over time, peasants developed better techniques for sealing their homes. Wealthier peasants might line their shutters with bits of fur or cloth. Some found ways to trap warmth during the day by letting in sunlight and then sealing everything tight before dusk. Still, nothing was foolproof. Winter claimed its victims. Infants and the elderly were most vulnerable. A single exposed window on a stormy night could lower the interior temperature enough to bring on illness. Cold led to pneumonia, which could mean death. And so, with each nail driven into a shutter, with each scrap of cloth pressed to the wall. Peasants fought back not with swords or shields, but with quiet acts of defiance against nature's cruelty. Covered window, as simple as it seems, became a symbol of that defiance. It was both shield and blindfold, protection and prison. It separated the fragile warmth of the home from the deathly silence of the frozen night. And while it let in only a dim, uncertain light, it was enough. Enough to read a face by firelight. Enough to find your child's hand in the dark. Enough to make it through until morning dot in the modern world, where glass keeps out the wind and thermostats keep rooms toasty. It is easy to forget how thin the line once was between survival and death. But in the medieval past, that line often ran right through a window hole, sealed with cloth soaked in oil, or shut tight with a splintery wooden board. And behind that barrier, a family would breathe quietly in the dark, holding one another close, praying that dawn would come soon and that the fire would last the night. Communal warmth was key during feasts and gatherings. Winter in the medieval countryside could be cruel and unforgiving. The sun vanished early behind gray skies. The winds howled through the thatched rooftops, and frost turned roads into treacherous ribbons of ice. For peasants, life was already hard enough. Their homes were small and drafty, their clothing coarse and limited, and food supplies often dwindled by January. The fire in the hearth could only do so much. Yet even in the depths of winter, medieval peasants had a secret weapon against the cold, one that was not built of stone or fueled by wood. It was each other. Communal warmth, physical, emotional, and spiritual, played a powerful role in helping people survive the coldest nights, especially during feasts and gatherings. In villages dotted across the countryside, the cold could feel like a living thing. It crept through the gaps in wooden shutters, slipped under door frames, and nested in the corners of unheated rooms. Peasant families, already squeezed into tight spaces, knew they had to rely on more than just their own hearths to stay warm. When it was too cold to labor in the fields and too dark for long travels, people turned inward toward their communities. And what brought people together better than food, stories, and shared moments of celebration? Feasts in the dead of winter might sound like a luxury, but they were often more of a necessity. These events weren't extravagant affairs with long tables groaning under the weight of game birds and fine wine. Instead, they were modest gatherings where families pooled resources: preserved meats, dried legumes, root vegetables, maybe a little ale if luck had been kind to share what little they had in common. The food was not the point, not entirely. The warmth of many bodies in a single room, the glow of shared firelight, the thrum of voices echoing off timber walls. These were the true sources of comfort. Asterisk, when people came together for winter feasts or village celebrations, the warmth was immediate. Even in a poorly insulated hall or barn, the heat from dozens of bodies could raise the temperature several degrees. People sat shoulder to shoulder, cloaks brushing against each other, fingers wrapped around rough pottery cups filled with something hot or strong. Laughter rolled out like a shield against the cold. Children tumbled between legs and benches, cheeks red with exertion and warmth, while old folks clapped along to tunes plucked out on fiddles or flutes. A feast was not just about filling stomachs. It was about pushing back the darkness, reminding everyone they weren't alone. These gatherings were often tied to important moments in the calendar. Christmas, Candlemas, and the Feast of St. Bridget were all opportunities to come together and share warmth. Pagan traditions also lingered in quiet corners of the Christian calendar. Bonfires were lit to ward off evil spirits or bless the year ahead, and in doing so, they gave people one more excuse to gather around a central blaze. Fire was sacred, yes, but it was also deeply practical. A large fire at the center of a communal event gave off enough heat to let people stretch out, thaw their hands, and maybe remove their outer layers for a few brief hours of comfort. There was also the emotional warmth that these gatherings kindled. Living in isolation, shivering in the quiet of a cold night, was a path to despair. But sharing stories, singing old songs, laughing over misfortunes, and toasting to the spring that kept spirits alive, the knowledge that everyone was suffering together, and that everyone had a place in the group, could make even the harshest winter feel survivable. A shared hardship created shared strength. Inside the longhouse or hall where such feasts were held, there was an organized chaos to how warmth was distributed. Elders and infants were often given the warmest spots closest to the fire, wrapped in layers of wool and animal hide. Young men might brave the doorways, acting as a buffer to the cold wind, while women moved constantly between the cooking hearth and serving tables, their work helping keep them warm. The sheer number of tasks to keep a feast running, from tending the fire to stirring the pot to refilling mugs, meant there was little time to sit and grow cold. Sometimes these communal feasts were hosted by the lord of the manor, while serfs and peasants lived hard lives under the yoke of feudal duty. It was not uncommon for the local lord or lady to host a midwinter gathering, especially around Christmastide. These events were partially symbolic, an act of benevolence and religious obligation, but they also served a very real purpose. A gathering at the manor hall meant warmth, food, and a chance to rest. Even a day or two of reprieve could lift the morale of a starving village. But more often than not, it was the peasants themselves who organized their own gatherings. A barn might be cleared, a single large cauldron of stew placed at the center, and neighbors would trickle in with what little they could offer: a bundle of dried herbs, a jug of sour ale, a few apples stored since the fall. They came not just to eat, but to connect. They came because in a frozen world, human connection was a lifeline. Warmth was exchanged in every way imaginable: a shared bench, a borrowed cloak, a shoulder to lean on when the ale went to someone's head too fast. These were gestures of survival. At night's end, the crowd would disperse, each person taking a little of the heat and joy home with them. The memory of laughter and music stayed with them under scratchy wool blankets as they climbed into straw beds. That memory could keep the cold at bay just long enough to let sleep come. Feasts also created moments of hope. For a few hours, the harsh reality of winter could be forgotten. Children heard tales of spring flowers and green fields. Old men boasted of winters past and how they had survived them. Young lovers might sneak a moment of privacy behind the livestock stalls. A winter feast was a patchwork of warmth, bodily, emotional, spiritual. It stitched people together and reminded them that while the cold was relentless, so too was the human will to endure. And so, year after year, despite hunger, sickness, and bitter wind, the people gathered. They turned to one another for heat, for sustenance, for comfort. In doing so, they kept something alive, something deeper than the fires they built or the meals they shared. They kept alive a sense of belonging, a spark of joy, a stubborn refusal to let winter win. When the snow lay thick on the fields and the sky seemed made of iron, peasants turned toward one another. They danced, sang, drank, and huddled close, not just because it was tradition, but because it was survival. The cold could break a man on his own, but a community with shared warmth of bodies, of hearts, of stories, could make it through the longest, darkest nights. In the end, it wasn't just the fire in the hearth that kept medieval peasants alive. It was the fire in each other. Cold was a constant battle, but they adapted. Winter did not just visit the medieval world, it conquered it. From the first frost that crept into the fields to the deep snows that blanketed the villages, cold was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a constant battle. For the medieval peasant, whose life was already one of endless toil and limited means, winter brought a fresh set of miseries. Yet somehow, year after year, they adapted. They didn't have down jackets or central heating, but they had something just as powerful: resourcefulness, tradition, and an unshakable will to survive. The first weapon in their fight against the cold was knowledge passed down through generations. Survival in the medieval world depended not just on strength, but on memory. You remembered what your mother told you, what your grandfather had done, how your neighbors managed last year when the snow fell early. Before winter set in, peasants would prepare their homes as best they could. Mud and dung would be packed into the cracks in their walls. Straw would be piled against the base of the house to block drafts. If there were any spare cloth or old thatching, it might be nailed over gaps or used to plug holes where the wind howled through. Peasant homes were small by modern standards, often one-room structures made of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. But this tight space could be an advantage in winter. Smaller rooms meant heat, what little there was, had less area to escape. The hearth in the center of the room was more than a place to cook. It was the heart of the home, the only consistent source of warmth. Fires were kept burning as long as fuel lasted, and people huddled close together on the coldest nights, letting the flickering flames ward off the worst of the chill. Firewood, however, was a precious commodity. In many places, peasants had limited access to forests, which were often owned by lords or the church. Gathering wood without permission could lead to punishment, so they had to be creative. Dried dung, especially from cattle, was collected and shaped into patties that could be burned. Peat was cut and stored when available. Even dried weeds, branches, and crop waste were saved to stretch the supply. Nothing was wasted. Nothing could be. Inside the home, warmth was shared. Entire families slept in the same bed, not out of sentimentality, but necessity. Bodies pressed close together generated a surprising amount of heat. Even the family dog or a penned lamb might be invited into the bedding arrangement. If the household was large enough, rotating shifts near the hearth might be arranged during the coldest part of the night. One person would tend the fire while the others slept, then switch. It was tiring, but it was a system that worked. Clothing was not a daily choice, but a strategic defense. Peasants did not undress for bed. They layered what little they had and slept fully clothed, often wearing the same garments for weeks. Wool was the material of choice, not for comfort, but for function. Even when wet, wool could retain warmth. Undergarments of linen added a base layer that helped trap body heat. Hoods, caps, and scarves were tied around heads and necks. Feet were wrapped in cloth or pushed under a sleeping partner. No part of the body was left exposed without cause. Sleeping arrangements were rough. Beds were often sacks of straw, refreshed as rarely as resources allowed. If you had a blanket, it might be a coarse woolen one, perhaps patched a dozen times over. If not, you made do with old cloaks, furs, or even woven mats. Families with some means might hang a curtain or drape cloth around the bed to create a small insulated cocoon. Others would tuck themselves into corners or alcoves, using the architecture of their home to block wind and conserve warmth. Adaptation extended beyond clothing and bedding. It was a mindset woven into daily life. Peasants adjusted their schedules to the rhythm of the sun and the temperature. When the days grew short, they rose later and went to bed earlier. They conserved their energy and their resources. Work outside was minimized when possible. Tasks that could be done indoors, such as mending clothes or weaving baskets, were pushed into the winter months. The body needed its strength to keep warm. Every step outdoors was a risk, but the outdoors could not be avoided. Animals had to be fed, wood gathered, and latrines dug. In some villages, communal efforts were made to help each other. Neighbors shared food and warmth. If someone had extra fuel, They might trade it for a bit of milk or eggs. Older children helped look after the younger ones, while adults braved the cold for essential chores. Community wasn't just social, it was survival. Meals in winter were smaller, simpler, and meant to fill the belly with something warm. Thick porridge, cabbage stew, and dense bread were staples. Anything hot was a comfort. On especially cold nights, stones were heated in the hearth and wrapped in cloth to be placed in beds or laps. The heat would last only a short while, but sometimes that was enough to drift off to sleep. Faith, too, played a role in survival. The cold was not just an environmental challenge. It was often interpreted as a test or punishment. Peasants prayed for mild winters and gave thanks for every day they made it through without illness or frostbite. Churches offered shelter to the desperate. Monks sometimes distributed food or firewood. Though the church could be a source of fear in winter, it was often a rare source of aid. Illness loomed large during the cold months. Colds and fevers were common, but without modern medicine, even minor ailments could become fatal. Dampness and poor ventilation meant that homes were breeding grounds for disease. Peasants did what they could, wrapping the sick in furs, feeding them broths, lighting fires as long as fuel allowed. Sometimes all they could do was hope. Death was never. Far in the medieval world, and winter sharpened its blade, still the peasants endured. They found joy where they could. Winter brought long evenings, which meant more time for storytelling and songs. Around the fire, children listened to tales of saints and spirits, and adults remembered better harvests and brighter days. The cold was cruel, but it also brought people closer. It reminded them of the value of warmth, both physical and human. Over time, certain innovations helped. Chimneys began to appear in wealthier homes, helping smoke escape and making fires more efficient. Thatched roofs became thicker. Some houses were built partly into the earth to shield them from the wind. But these changes came slowly and unevenly. Most peasants continued to live much as their ancestors had, relying on the same basic strategies to get through winter. Every year, winter tested them. Some years it was merciful. Other years it was relentless. But medieval peasants, for all their hardships, were survivors. They learned to live with the cold, not by fighting it head-on, but by bending around it, preparing for it, adapting to it. Their lives were shaped by the turning seasons, and winter carved its name deep into their bones. Cold was a constant battle, but through layer upon layer of wool, through beds shared with kin and creatures alike, through smoke-filled huts and humble meals, the medieval peasant endured. Their methods were born of necessity, their resilience forged in frost. In a world that offered little comfort, they found a way to live anyway. And so the story of those long, frozen nights is not just a tale of suffering. It is a tale of quiet ingenuity, of small triumphs, of warmth found in the darkest seasons. The cold came every year, but so did spring. The battle was never easy, but it was never entirely lost. They survived because they adapted, and they adapted because they had to. That was the rhythm of their world, brutal, beautiful, and, above all, enduring. So when the bitter winds howled and the darkness pressed in from all sides, the medieval peasant did not rely on grand solutions or luxurious comforts. They turned inward to their homes, their families, their traditions, and the quiet wisdom passed down through generations. Winter never grew easier. It never gave mercy. But they adapted because they had to. Their lives depended on the small decisions made every single day. How to preserve heat, how to ration fuel, how to sleep without freezing. These weren't just strategies. They were acts of survival, repeated year after year, like rituals carved into the soul of peasant life. Coldest nights tested everything. They tested the strength of their homes, the endurance of their bodies, the limits of their clothing, and the warmth of their relationships. But even in the harshest nights, there was still life. There were stories shared around the hearth, whispered, prayers before sleep, and the soft breathing of children buried under cloaks and straw. The struggle was real, but so was the resilience. And that resilience, the quiet, patient, relentless kind, was perhaps the most powerful warmth of all that, as spring crept in and the snow melted away. The peasants emerged from their dark homes, blinking into the light, thinner but alive. The fields would need tending, the animals would need grazing, and the cycle of the seasons would begin again. But for a brief moment, they could breathe. They had made it through the long, bone-deep cold. They had outlasted another winter. We live in a different world now. A world where the flick of a switch chases away the chill, where warm showers and thick duvets are taken for granted. But when you pause to imagine that long, freezing night in a peasant hut, surrounded by your family, wrapped in every scrap of cloth you own, you begin to appreciate what it meant to endure. Not just to survive, but to hold on to life with both hands, despite the odds. Their nights were long. Their winters were brutal. But medieval peasants survived by relying on each other, trusting in their customs, and refusing to give in to the cold. They didn't have much, but what they had they used wisely. Their story is not just about hardship. It's about human tenacity, about how even the poorest, the least protected, the most vulnerable among us can face nature's fury. And live to see the sun rise again. Thank you for watching. If you found yourself transported back in time, if you could feel the chill of a medieval winter and the warmth of a peasant hearth, then don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There are countless forgotten corners of history waiting to be uncovered, and together we'll keep the stories alive. Until next time, stay warm and stay curious.